The shredder in Eleanore Vance's Newport mansion didn't roar. It hummed with a quiet, expensive efficiency. It was a heavy commercial-grade machine specifically chosen to turn sensitive stock portfolios and inconvenient family legalities into unreadable white lint. Alyssa stood completely still on the hand-woven rug, her worn deck shoes leaving 2 faint, damp imprints from the coastal sleet outside. On the polished mahogany desk lay her acceptance letter into the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. Not just a standard appointment, but a rare, highly coveted strategic subsurface commander track accompanied by a full leadership scholarship. She had beaten out nearly 5,000 other applicants. She had scored a perfect 100 on her maritime aptitude and physical endurance matrices. Eleanore didn't even look up as she fed the thick, cream-colored parchment with the gold-embossed Department of the Navy seal into the machine's steel teeth. Chomp, whir, dust. You are operating under the delusion that your existence belongs to you, Alyssa, Eleanore said. Her voice was like chilled vodka, smooth, expensive, and entirely devoid of human warmth. She brushed a non-existent speck of ash from her Chanel tweed cuff. It does not. Every calorie you have consumed under this roof, every hour of elite prep school tutoring you received, and the very air you breathe in this house has been a capital investment made by the Vance estate, and we expect a return. It's a direct commission, Eleanore, Alyssa said, her voice dangerously quiet, tight as a steel cable under tension. I earned it. I didn't use the family name. I didn't use your high-priced corporate lawyers. I did it on my own. Eleanore finally raised her eyes. They were the color of stagnant sea ice. A commission. You want to be a chauffeur for Uncle Sam? A glorified boat driver in a damp jumpsuit sweating in some rusting tin can beneath the ocean for $80,000 a year. Don't be pathetic. She picked up a heavy leather-bound folder and tossed it carelessly across the desk. It slid over the polished wood and bumped against Alyssa's knuckles. Manhattan Commercial Bank, Eleanore stated. The Sterling family. You will fly to Aspen this weekend, you will sit next to Charles Sterling's eldest son, and you will be charming. By your 21st birthday, you will sign the marital merger. Your womb will secure our liquid corporate credit line through the next fiscal quarter, and your name will remain a footnote in the registry of this family's assets. That is your sole purpose. And Cassandra, Alyssa asked, though she already knew the answer. The venom in her own throat tasted like copper. Eleanore smiled a thin, razor-sharp line. Cassandra is the heir. Cassandra is currently in London completing her corporate governance thesis before taking her rightful seat as chairwoman of the executive board. She is a Vance. You are a liability. A worthless overhead cost we have tolerated until you could be properly liquidated into a banking alliance. Do not mistake your genetic proximity to this house for worth. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the soft drip-drip of freezing rain against the triple-paned windows overlooking the Atlantic cliffside. Alyssa looked down at the shredder. A few stray flakes of her future, the words, Subsurface Strategic Command and the President of the United States reposes special trust and confidence, lay trapped in the plastic bin reduced to confetti. Something died inside Alyssa in that room. And in its place, something ironclad, deep-sea, dense and feral, took root. I won't go to Aspen, Alyssa said. Eleanore didn't rage. She didn't scream. She simply picked up her fountain pen, her expression utterly bored. Then you will leave tonight with nothing. If you are not an asset to this family, you are an intruder. And I do not harbor trespassers. The blizzard hit the Rhode Island coast at midnight, a howling visibility zero monster that choked the streets of Newport in a shroud of white ice. Alyssa didn't call a car. She walked down the long, winding brick driveway of the Vance estate, the heavy wrought iron gates clanging shut behind her, like the jaws of a trap. On her back were 2 olive-drab canvas duffel bags, old military surplus she had bought cash in hand at a pawn shop in Providence 3 months ago, anticipating this exact day. Inside were 3 changes of utilitarian clothes, her birth certificate, a pair of worn deck shoes, and exactly $84. When she stepped onto the coastal highway, the wind hit her like a physical blow, driving needles of ice straight through her thin wool coat. She didn't look back. She didn't look up at the warm amber lights of the mansion windows overlooking the bay. She walked 4 miles through the freezing dark to a local transit station, her feet aching, her fingers turning a dangerous shade of waxy white. 3 weeks later, she was standing on the wet concrete of Recruit Training Command before being diverted to the brutal, unyielding gauntlet of specialized dive and submarine operational training in the deep waters of the Pacific Northwest. The transition wasn't a transition, it was a meat grinder. The Navy didn't care about her pedigree, and the instructors cared even less about her trauma. They saw a girl from a Newport mansion with high cheekbones and assumed she would crack under pressure like cheap glass. "You think you're special, Vance?" A master diver roared in her face, his breath reeking of stale coffee and chewing tobacco while she held a heavy oxygen cylinder over her head in a freezing Pacific downpour at 0400 hours. "You look like a stiff breeze could sink you to the bottom drop. Give me 50 push-ups in the surf. Now." She dropped into the freezing brine. The wet sand and sharp gravel tore through the palms of her hands, embedding sharp flint into her flesh. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry in Eleanor's study. During hyperbaric training in the dark, pressurized depths of the training trenches, the isolation was absolute. She lived in claustrophobic steel tubes, breathing recycled metallic air, learning to navigate by sound alone in pitch-black waters, where the pressure reached hundreds of pounds per square inch. Her skin became mapped with a geography of operational violence, deep, jagged scars from rusted hatch hinges, hydraulic fluid burns from engine maintenance drills, and the permanent dull ache in her ears from endless pressure. Equalization. While Cassandra was being photographed by Vogue at a high society charity gala in London, Alyssa was strapped into a wet escape trunk simulator, the freezing salt water rising to her chin in total darkness, while instructors simulated a catastrophic hull breach testing if her heart rate would spike before she could clear the lock. Every time she felt her consciousness slipping, every time her lungs screamed for air, and her mind tempted her to quit, to beg Eleanor for forgiveness and marry the bank heir, she would see the image of that German-engineered shredder turning her life into lint. She didn't break. She hardened. She became a creature of pure concentrated resilience and lethal subsurface capability. Operation Deep Abyss location. Vale of Anadir / Chukotka. Trench boundary. Classified. AOR date. November 14th, 2024. Status, top secret, / nested, black. The ocean. 700 meters below the Arctic ice sheet wasn't just dark. It was a crushing, terrifying void. Alyssa's hands were locked onto the dual-axis controls of the Valkyrie 9, a heavily modified radar-absorbent stealth reconnaissance submersible that didn't officially exist on any Pentagon ledger. The cabin air temperature was hovering just above freezing. The primary environmental unit had died an hour ago, when a foreign acoustic homing torpedo detonated 50 meters off her stern, sending a violent shockwave through her hull. The mission was a disaster. A 6-man Navy SEAL Tier 1 reconnaissance team had been compromised deep within a restricted underwater trench. Their insertion vehicle was disabled, and they were pinned down inside a collapsing subglacial pocket running out of oxygen, while hostile anti-submarine vessels patrolled the surface grid above. Command had already written them off. Sending a recovery craft through the active acoustic sensor net was deemed an unacceptable risk to strategic military assets. Alyssa had looked at her squadron commander at Naval Station Everett and said, "They're alive. I'm going down." Now she was navigating a pitch-black labyrinth of underwater canyons, masking her acoustic signature by flying down the throats of razor-sharp thermal currents. Warning: hydraulic pressure failing. Main rudder unresponsive. The synthetic female voice of the helm computer chimed a cold mechanical contrast to the chaos outside. "Shut up, Betty," Alyssa muttered, her teeth chattering violently as she wiped a smear of condensation and hydraulic grease from the main console. Suddenly, the passive sonar display flared blood red. An active ping illuminated their position. "Torpedo inbound bearing 040, her co-pilot. A young lieutenant named Miller screamed over the encrypted comms. Alyssa didn't blink. She violently threw the manual ballast overrides, dumping her trim tanks and putting the submersible into a near-vertical dive that violated every structural depth limit engineered into the titanium hull. The torpedo streaked past their sail, its proximity fuse detonating 30 meters above them. The concussion wave slammed the submersible sideways into a canyon wall, buckling the starboard hull plates with a sickening screech of tearing metal. The starboard electrical bus instantly died, erupting into a violent spray of sparks and acrid white smoke. "We lost primary propulsion structural integrity down to 40%. We have to blow the emergency ballast and surface, Captain," Miller yelled, his hands shaking as he reached for the yellow safety levers. "Touch those levers, Miller, and I'll throw you out the hatch," Alyssa roared back, her voice cutting through the alarms like a gunshot. "We are not leaving those men to suffocate in the dark." With one propulsion bank dead, the right side of her craft buckled inward, and dark hydraulic fluid spraying onto the deck plates, she used sheer brute physical intuition to catch a high-speed blind undercurrent. She steered the dying vehicle by throttling the remaining port turbine, navigating entirely by acoustic echolocation, until she wedged the canted, unstable submersible into the mouth of the glacial cave. "Secure the lock! Get them in!" she screamed into the internal net. The 6 wounded operators, coughing up blood from hypercapnia, carbon dioxide poisoning, and freezing from hypothermia, dragged themselves through the lower hatch. The moment the lock sealed, Alyssa engaged the emergency thrusters. The remaining turbine groaned a horrible metal-on-metal shriek that vibrated through the steel soles of her deck shoes. As they backed out, a second acoustic sensor pinged them. She didn't flinch. She locked her jaw, ignored the freezing water pooling around her ankles from a weeping hull seam, and nursed the burning, crippled ghost of a submarine back across the maritime boundary, flying blind through the deep black ocean on raw, unadulterated defiance. They surfaced beside a covert mobile tender vessel with 0 battery reserves, 0 hydraulic pressure, and a starboard hull that looked like it had been chewed on by a leviathan. 3 weeks later, in a windowless bunker beneath the Pentagon, a 4-star admiral pinned the Navy Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism, onto her uniform jacket. There were no cameras. There were no press releases. "You did an incredible thing, Captain Vance," the admiral said, his voice solemn. "But because of where you were and whose territorial waters you violated, this medal stays in this box. Your file is locked behind a black budget firewall. As far as the civilian world is concerned, this mission never occurred. You were never there." Alyssa looked at the beautiful heavy metal in the velvet-lined case. She thought of Eleanor's shredder. She thought of the Newport elite. "That's fine, Admiral," Alyssa said, adjusting her officer's cap. "I don't do it for the audience." 2 years later, Thanksgiving 2026. The Vance family estate in Newport, Rhode Island, was bathed in the warm golden glow of thousands of imported fairy lights. The long brick driveway was clogged with luxury European sedans, sports cars, and private security details. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted truffles, expensive champagne, and the suffocating arrogance of old, untouchable coastal money. Eleanore Vance sat at the head of a mahogany dining table that could comfortably seat 40 people. To her right sat Cassandra, dressed in a bespoke silk gown, her hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the newly appointed chairwoman of the executive board who had never worked a day of physical labor in her life. "Have any of you heard from the outcast?" asked Aunt Evelyn, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux with a patronizing smirk. Eleanor offered a thin, dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Alyssa. Last I heard from our family attorneys, she's some sort of low-level logistics clerk in Washington, a glorified secretary for the military. She spends her days in some windowless basement gunked up with motor oil, counting nuts and bolts, sweeping out old naval supply warehouses for a government check that wouldn't buy a single pair of my shoes." Cassandra laughed a shallow, high-pitched sound. "I still can't believe she traded a Newport real estate and banking dynasty for $70 a week in a stiff Navy uniform. She always did have a peasant's mentality, probably out there right now polishing brass on some tugboat for real men." The table chuckled a polite, cruel symphony of elite condescension. 500 miles away and 400 meters beneath the rolling storm-tossed waves of the Atlantic Ocean, the world looked entirely different. The command deck of the Virginia-class fast-attack submarine was dead silent, save for the low, reassuring hum of the nuclear reactor's cooling loops and the rhythmic, deep breathing of the watch officers. The instrument panels glowed with a cool emerald green hue, casting sharp angles across Alyssa's face. On her shoulder, hidden beneath her working blues, was the scar from the Arctic hull breach. In her private locker back at Naval Station Norfolk sat a locked wooden box containing a medal her family didn't have the security clearance to look at. She leaned against the periscope housing, looking over the sonar waterfall displays. Below the surface, she wasn't an asset on a corporate balance sheet. She wasn't a pawn in a marital credit merger. She was the commanding officer of a multi-billion-dollar weapon of global strategic deterrence. She owned the deep. A radio technician turned to her, holding a high-security headset. "Captain Vance, message from ComSub 4, via the VLF encrypted satellite array. Airspace and surface sectors are clear. We are cleared for tactical transit." "Roger sonar," Alyssa replied. Her voice was steady, calm, and utterly free of the ghosts of her past. "Engage the main propulsion drives. Take us down to 500 meters. The nuclear-powered turbines surged forward, generating tens of thousands of horsepower with an immediate, terrifying silence. The massive steel hull slid through the deep ocean currents, completely isolated from the world above. They thought she was under their boots. They thought she was sweeping floors in the dark. But as Alyssa looked at the digital navigation display, showing the continental shelf dropping away into the boundless, uncharted depths of the sea, she smiled. Eleanore and Cassandra would never understand that while they were busy inheriting the Earth, she had already conquered the abyss. The acoustics inside the Sky Anvil Dome were meticulously engineered to amplify the voices of billionaires and swallow the pleas of ordinary men. Perched on the 76th floor of the Columbia Center Tower, the VIP conference hall featured sweeping walls of curved structural glass, hand-buffed walnut paneling, and a panoramic view of the cold slate-gray waters of Puget Sound freezing over far below. Eleanore Vance sat at the long mahogany table on the plaintiff's side, her posture as rigid and predatory as a coastal falcon. Next to her sat Arthur Vance, Alyssa's biological father, his face weathered by Scotch corporate anxieties and the quiet desperation of a man whose multi-million-dollar maritime empire was bleeding liquid capital from 1,000 cuts. Completing the triumvirate was Cassandra, looking impeccably slick in a double-breasted charcoal silk gown, a diamond signet ring glinting as she rotated an empty crystal champagne glass between her fingers. Flanking them was their lead counsel and corporate fixer, a ruthless litigator who shared their blood and their cruelty, Richard Vance. Then the heavy bronze-reinforced double doors at the back of the dome groaned open. Alyssa didn't walk, she marched. The rhythm of her heels was a sharp military staccato that shattered the room's engineered tranquility. She was dressed in her full Navy service dress, white uniform, the high-collared white fabric pristine, the gold-braided shoulder boards catching the amber chandelier light. Across her left breast, a dense multicolored mosaic of ribbon bars, including the deep sky-blue field of the Navy Cross, sat pinned in flawless regulation alignment. But it was her feet that drew everyone's eyes. She hadn't had time to change. Her heavy combat boots were old-scarred and heavily scuffed at the steel toes. A dark, tacky rim of dried Pacific brine, crushed volcanic soil, and hydraulic residue clung to the welt of her left boot, leaving a faint chemical ghost of a footprint on the cream-colored luxury carpeting. She had stepped directly out of an operational helicopter at Naval Station Everett 45 minutes ago, ignoring the flight surgeon's orders to decompress, and driven straight into the jaws of her family's trap. "Look what the tide washed up," Cassandra murmured, her voice dripping with theatrical pity. She signaled a waiter and immediately picked up a fresh glass of Roederer Cristal champagne. "Still tracking grease into clean rooms, Alyssa. Some habits from the maintenance ditches just never wash out, do they?" Alyssa didn't answer. She stood at the isolated table reserved for the respondent. She didn't sit down. She placed her officer's cover precisely under her left arm and met her stepmother's freezing gaze with a flat, unblinking stare. "Let the record show." Richard Vance began, his voice booming as he stood up and buttoned his jacket, addressing the panel of 3 federal compliance arbitrators sitting at the center bench, that the respondent, Captain Alyssa Vance, has finally seen fit to grace this urgent national security restructuring hearing with her presence. Though by the looks of her, she treats a federal defense asset dispute like a casual stop at a shipyard repair bay. Arthur Vance let out a low, gravelly cough. "Sit down, Alyssa. You're making a scene looking like that. You're a Vance, even if you dress like a mechanic." "I am on active duty, Mr. Vance," Alyssa said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying low-frequency resonance born from years of shouting over the roar of heavy naval machinery. "And I do not sit in the presence of hostile entities." Cassandra laughed a sharp, ugly bark that echoed off the silk-lined walls. She leaned across the table, picked up a burning, hand-rolled cigarette from the crystal ashtray, and blew a thin stream of gray smoke directly toward Alyssa's face. "Active duty?" Cassandra mocked, her eyes wide with malicious glee. She flicked the burning ember of her cigarette directly over the table. A heavy clump of gray ash fell squarely onto Alyssa's bound case file on her podium, smudging the neat print of her legal defense brief with a dirty black streak. "You hear that, gentlemen? She thinks because she types out cargo manifest spreadsheets and counts rusted gaskets in a secure bunker under Washington. She's a warrior. Let's be real for a second, sister. The real weight of the global defense network doesn't belong to the grunt who changes the oil filters. It belongs to the people who control the capital. The 9-figure federal defense contracts that keep your little submarines in the water, I sign those. My board approves those. You are an administrative line item." She took a slow sip of her champagne, leaning forward until her face was framed by the curved glass of the dome. "The Hawaii Oceanographic Research Complex." Richard Vance stepped forward, dropping a massive gold-stamped binder onto the table. "An asset legally structured under an old obscure trust from your late grandfather. You have held on to it out of pure, unadulterated selfishness, Captain. Right now, Vance Maritime Systems is facing a severe liquidity crisis due to a series of unfortunate supply chain overruns. We are on the verge of defaulting on a major Pentagon contract for deep-sea acoustic sensor arrays." "A crisis caused by Cassandra's gross incompetence?" Alyssa noted calmly. She shorted the rare earth futures market in April to buy a private island estate in the Bahamas. I read the unclassified SEC filings. Cassandra's face flushed an angry mottled purple. "Shut your mouth. You don't know the first thing about capital allocation." "The point?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through Cassandra's rage like a scalpel. "Is that you will sign the Hawaii transfer paperwork over to Cassandra's management structure today. Right here, in front of these federal arbiters. It is a drop in the ocean for what you owe this house. You will surrender the property to secure our federal credit lines, or we will strip everything you think you've built out from under you." Cassandra leaned back, crossing her legs, a smug smile returning to her face. "Think of it as a liquidation event, Alyssa. A signature today to bail out the family name to pay us back for the 15 years you spent eating our food, burning our electricity, and acting as a worthless overhead liability in our home. Sign the paper. Go back to your little office, and we might even let you keep using our last name on your Navy name tag." Richard Vance smiled, reaching into his leather briefcase to draw the final card. "To demonstrate the sheer magnitude of the respondent's debt to the Vance family estate, we have compiled an audited accounting." He slapped a thick stack of laminated ledger pages onto the table, sliding them toward the federal arbitrators. The top sheet bore a bold corporate-style title, "Invoice for Retroactive Dependent Maintenance Costs, 1998 to 2013. "Every premium cut of fish she consumed," Richard announced, his voice ringing with theatrical outrage. "Every dollar of private school tuition that she deliberately wasted by failing to pursue a business degree. Every medical copay. Every flight ticket to European maritime summits she attended as a child decoration. The cost of her room's square footage in the Newport mansion adjusted for real estate inflation over 15 years. The total comes to exactly $6.4 million. The federal arbitrators leaned forward, their faces unreadable, flipping through the meticulously falsified receipts and fabricated line items. Arthur Vance slammed his heavy crystal glass down onto the table. The remaining champagne splashed across the polished wood like acid. "You have been a parasite on my ledger since the day you were born, Alyssa. You ran away like a coward in the middle of a winter storm because you knew you didn't have the stomach to do what was necessary for this family. You stole an education from the state because you were too arrogant to accept the marriage we arranged to save our banking alliances." He leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table, his voice dropping into a venomous hiss. "You think that white uniform protects you? You think those cheap pieces of metal on your chest make you untouchable? I still own 3 major media conglomerates on the eastern seaboard, girl. If you do not sign that transfer within the next 5 minutes, my PR firms will launch a scorched earth campaign before the evening news cycle. We have psychiatric reports carefully drafted by professionals detailing your history of unstable behavior, childhood delusions, and erratic military misconduct. We will paint you as a broken, unhinged diver who is a danger to national security. The Navy will strip your commission before sunrise. You'll be court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and left rotting in a federal brig." Eleanore leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Alyssa like a hawk watching a mouse in a trap. "Sign it, Alyssa, or we will erase you from existence, just like I erased that pathetic little acceptance letter 10 years ago." The air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy. The silence was total, save for the hum of the high-rise HVAC system. Cassandra was grinning, swirling her champagne, waiting for the tears, waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the broken girl from the Newport study to finally fall to her knees. Alyssa didn't blink. She didn't look at the fraudulent invoices. She didn't look at the ash smudging her papers. Inside her mind, she wasn't in a plush high-rise in Seattle. She was back in the pressure hull of the burning Valkyrie 9 over the Anadir Trench, with freezing water chewing through her floorboards and the cold voice of the computer warning her of total structural collapse. Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2, 3, 4. She initiated tactical box breathing, the biometric override technique she had mastered during high-pressure submarine escape drills. Her autonomic nervous system responded instantly. The surge of adrenaline in her bloodstream was intercepted, channeled, and neutralized. Under her ribs, her heart rate locked at a flat, unyielding 60 beats per minute. Her vision sharpened until she could see the microscopic trembling in her father's hands, the nervous sweat glistening under Cassandra's expensive perfume, and the tiny, desperate twitch in Richard Vance's left eyelid. They thought they were the predators. They didn't realize they had just walked into targeted waters. "Are you finished?" Alyssa asked. Her voice was ice water, entirely devoid of fear, anger, or even resentment. It was the voice of a commander reading a weapons checklist before firing. "What did you say?" Arthur growled, taken aback by the total lack of leverage his threats had produced. Alyssa reached into her jacket pocket. Cassandra smiled, expecting her to pull out a pen to sign away her life. Instead, Alyssa pulled out a sleek, matte black military encrypted tablet and tapped the screen twice. "Mr. Vance," Alyssa said, looking directly at the corporate lawyer, "the Hawaii Oceanographic Research Complex is not a commercial trust. As of January of last year, under Presidential Executive Order 13,500, 26 and the National Defense Authorization Act, the entire facility was permanently absorbed into a special access program codenamed Project Trench Sentinel. It is a Tier 1 federal installation developing low observable acoustic propulsion systems for strategic subsurface command." She tapped the screen again, and Richard Vance's personal tablet on the table hummed with an incoming high-security alert. The lawyer's arrogant smile instantly vanished as he looked down at the display. "What you, Cassandra and my biological parents have just done," Alyssa continued smoothly, her heart rate sitting perfectly at 60, is bring a civilian corporate litigation suit against a classified military asset. You have placed fabricated invoices containing demands for capital extorted from a federal officer onto an official record. More importantly, Cassandra, The cigarette ash you just dropped on my file contains telemetry data regarding Project Trench Sentinel that was printed on high-security, sensitive compartmented information paper. Cassandra frowned, her hand freezing with the glass halfway to her mouth. What the hell are you talking about? Suddenly, the heavy bronze doors of the Sky Anvil Dome didn't just open, they were kicked off their latches. 4 men in full tactical gear wearing black combat armor with Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, and Defense. Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, patches moved into the room with terrifying lethal speed. Behind them stepped a grim-faced admiral wearing full service dress. Richard Vance. Cassandra Vance. Arthur Vance, the admiral announced, his voice echoing like iron on stone. Under Article 104 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and Title 18 of the U.S. Criminal Code regarding espionage and the unlawful targeting of classified defense production facilities, this room is now an active federal crime scene. Stand away from the tables. Keep your hands where we can see them. Cassandra gasped, dropping her champagne glass. It shattered against the mahogany table, soaking her pristine dress in sparkling wine. Mother, do something. Tell them who we are. Eleanor stood up, her face pale, her perfect composure finally fracturing into a mask of pure terror as 2 tactical officers stepped behind her chair, blocking her exit. This is an outrage. We are the Vances. We control the maritime supply chain. Not anymore, Eleanor, Alyssa said finally, picking up her officer's cover and placing it squarely on her head, adjusting the gold-embroidered anchor on the bill until it was perfectly level. She walked past her trembling father, past her hyperventilating sister, and past the stepmother who had once turned her future into paper dust. She didn't look back as the plastic zip ties clicked into place behind them. She walked out of the dome, her grease-stained boots leaving one final permanent mark on their pristine floor, ready to return to the only home that had ever truly claimed her, the endless, untouchable deep. Federal Judge Harold Bennett sat at the center of the judicial dais, his graying hair cropped in a strict traditional legal cut, his eyes sharp behind rimless spectacles. As the oversight arbitrator for the Department of Defense Procurement Controls, he had presided over hundreds of high-value corporate disputes. He was a man who viewed the world through the cold, unyielding prism of statutory law and contractual obligation. To him, the Vances were just another set of greedy maritime defense contractors, and Alyssa was a minor officer caught in a family gears of war machine. "Quiet in this room!" Judge Bennett commanded, his gavel coming down with a sound like a rifle shot. The chaotic protests of Eleanor and the frantic, high-pitched stammering of Cassandra died instantly in their throats. "Admiral, instruct your personnel to hold their positions. Before any administrative or physical arrests are processed under military jurisdiction, this tribunal will verify the evidentiary baseline." Richard Vance, his hands slightly trembling, but his legal instincts still fighting for survival, adjusted his silk tie. "Your Honor, this is a flagrant overreach of executive authority. My clients are civilians. This military intervention is an intimidation tactic designed to force a lawful transfer of the Hawaii assets." "Sit down, counselor." Judge Bennett cut him off, his voice flat. He reached for the thick steel-bound ledger that a military courier had just laid upon his bench. The binder was wrapped in a heavy synthetic dark gray cover sealed with red, tamper-evident security tape. Stenciled across the front in block letters were the words, Mark 10, Strategic Intel / Disarticulated Protocol. Embedded in the top right corner was a small glowing cryptographic interface blinking a steady amber pattern, a high-security electronic signature matrix labeled simply as document type .docs under the Joint Chiefs Black Budget Registry. Bennett peeled back the security tape. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner of the file. The amber light flickered, turned a sharp neon emerald, and a low chime echoed through the silent vault. The digital stencils on the first page decrypted in real time, shifting from scrambled algorithmic noise into clear, high-density government text. Alyssa stood at her podium, her heart rate remaining a locked, unbreakable 60 beats per minute. She watched the judge's eyes move across the document. The transformation on Harold Bennett's face was total, sudden, and devastating. The color drained from his cheeks until his skin matched the white of his linen shirt. His hand, which had held the gavel with absolute authority just moments before, began to visibly shake. The rimless glasses slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose, but he didn't adjust them. His lips parted in a silent, breathless gasp as he stared at the digital passport-style photograph embedded in the security profile and the electronic signature that sat beneath it. The signature read, Vance A. Admiral Commanding, Strategic Subsurface Reconnaissance, and Black Budget Logistics. Directives. The entire room froze. Cassandra was breathing heavily, her eyes darting between the judge and her mother, trying to read the shift in the wind. Eleanor's fingers clutched the edge of her mahogany chair so tightly her knuckles looked like polished ivory. Your Honor. Richard Vance ventured his voice, losing its booming confidence, dropping an octave into genuine hesitation. Is there an issue with the authentication of the property title? Judge Bennett did not look at the lawyer. He didn't look at Eleanor or Arthur. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the steel-bound ledger. He took off his glasses, placing them on the bench with a hand that was now violently trembling. He looked across the vast, luxurious expanse of the Sky Anvil dome, past the tactical gear and the broken champagne glass until his eyes locked onto Alyssa's grease-stained combat boots, then moved up to her calm, unyielding face. The silence in the room was no longer legal. It was visceral. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that occurs right before a dam breaks. Judge Bennett slowly pushed his chair back. He stood up. He didn't just stand to his feet. He straightened his spine, pulling himself out from behind the safety of his judicial bench until he was out in the open, fully exposed to the room. Then, the veteran federal judge, a man who represented the supreme civil authority of the United States government in this sector, did something that caused Eleanor Vance's breath to catch in her throat. He brought his feet together with a sharp, echoing snap. He raised his right hand to his brow, palm-flat fingers aligned, executing a flawless, trembling, and deeply reverent military salute directly toward Alyssa. The 4 NCIS and DCIS tactical operators instantly snapped to attention. Their weapons held across their chests, their helmets bowing slightly in unison. Admiral Vance, Judge Bennett said, his voice cracking thick with an emotion so raw and catastrophic it made the luxury of the VIP room look like cheap plastic. I did not know your true rank. The black budget firewalls obscured the command structure of the 2024 recovery operation. My office only received the redacted casualties and the survival manifests. Cassandra looked like she had been struck in the jaw. Admiral, what the hell are you talking about? She's a captain? Look at her shoulders. She's a glorified clerk. Shut up, you idiot, Bennett roared, turning a furious, tear-streaked face toward the plaintiff's table. You short-sighted, arrogant little parasites. You stand here talking about your 9-figure federal contracts and your luxury estates, while you have no conception of what keeps the ocean from swallowing you whole. The judge turned back to Alyssa, his hand dropping slowly to his side, his eyes filled with a profound, aching gratitude. Captain Alyssa Vance is a cover identity used for civilian-facing compliance, you fools, Bennett whispered, his voice trembling with a father's broken heart. 2 years ago in the Chukotka Trench, the Tier 1 Joint Reconnaissance Team that was left to die in the freezing dark, the team leader who was trapped inside the collapsing hull of that vehicle with his oxygen depleted and his ribs crushed. Bennett swallowed hard, a single tear escaping his eyelid and rolling down his cheek. That team leader was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Bennett, my only son. The room completely lost its air. Eleanor's jaw went slack. Arthur Vance staggered back a half step, his hand searching blindly for the back of his chair. The Pentagon told me he was gone, Bennett said, looking at Alyssa as if she were a ghost from a holy text. They told me no vessel could survive the acoustic radar grid. They told me the structural limits were impossible. But this woman, this overhead cost you talk about, she dragged my boy out of a crushing abyss under a hail of hostile acoustic torpedoes. She navigated a broken piece of titanium across an Arctic graveyard with her own blood filling her left boot. She gave me my son back. And you? You dared to bring an invoice for her childhood food into my court? own. Alyssa looked at the judge. Her expression did not soften into pity. It remained iron, but she gave him a brief, respectful nod of acknowledgement. Your son held the perimeter, Judge. He did his job, I did mine. Lieutenant Miller, activate the link, Alyssa said, her voice dropping like a heavy steel curtain over the emotional wreckage of the room. Her military lawyer, who had remained silent at her side, stepped forward and slammed a high-security flash drive into the federal projector hub. The massive high-definition displays covering the walnut walls of the Sky Anvil Dome flashed once, then exploded into a cascade of decrypted financial matrices, all drawn directly from the secure servers under the .docs classification protocol. Let's talk about debt, Alyssa said, her eyes turning slowly toward Eleanore. A massive red-flagged document from the Internal Revenue Service appeared on the screen, dated March 2021. 5 years ago, Alyssa stated, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel, the Vance estate was 3 days away from a public asset seizure by the federal government due to a $50,000 offshore tax discrepancy that Eleanore tried to hide in a shell account in the Caymans. You didn't notice the audit disappeared stepmother because you thought your high-priced accountants worked a miracle. Alyssa tapped her finger on her podium. The money didn't come from your accountants. It came from my hazardous duty deep-sea combat pay, wired through a blind military trust into the Federal Reserve to clear the lien so the Vance name wouldn't be dragged through the mud while I was deployed in hostile waters. I didn't do it for you. I did it because the Vance name was still attached to my military record, and I don't tolerate unvouched liabilities on my background check. Eleanor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her perfect manicured facade was completely crumbling. And then there's you, Cassandra. Alyssa turned her gaze to her sister. The screen shifted, displaying an official court docket from the Southern District of Ohio, dated August 2023. A commercial fraud investigation, Alyssa read from the screen, her tone dripping with professional disgust. You tried to skim $3 million from a regional naval logistics subcontract to cover your speculative market losses in international waters. The state prosecutors were preparing an indictment that would have ended your career before it started. The money that stayed the execution of that warrant came from my military honor trust, money granted to me by Congress alongside my decorations. I signed the release while I was in a recompression chamber in Germany, having damaged lung tissue evaluated. She walked around her podium, her heavy, brine-crusted combat boots clicking against the carpet, stopping just 3 feet from Cassandra. The corporate heiress shrank back into her seat, her face white, the sweat dripping from her chin onto her silk lapels. You told me that the weight of this world belongs to the people who sign 9-figure contracts. Cassandra, Mum, Alyssa said softly, her voice dangerously intimate. You told me I was a grunt who types manifest spreadsheets, but you forgot the fundamental rule of the maritime chain: the person who controls the subsurface clearance controls whether your cargo ever breathes air again. The final document on the screen did not display bank accounts or tax records. It was a massive flashing red schematic of a fiber optic microchip array embedded in a hull acoustic sensor stamped with the dual seals of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, and the National Security Agency. Across the top of the screen, the words flashed in a brutal neon red font. Project Treason / Sabotage Detection / Lockdown Initiated. The Hawaii Oceanographic Research Complex, Alyssa announced, turning back to face the entire Vance family and their frozen lawyer. Cassandra didn't want it to save the family business. She wanted it because she has already spent the last 6 months selling short-range supply guarantees to an unvouched foreign entity. She contracted to supply counterfeit, low-grade fiber optic microchips to the United States Navy's next-generation fast-attack submarine fleet chips that would fail under extreme deep-sea pressure conditions. That's a lie, Cassandra screamed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek of pure terror. Richard, tell them. It was just an optimization swap. It was a legal corporate restructuring. Richard Vance didn't speak. He had already taken 2 steps back from the Vance family table, his briefcase left open on the floor, his eyes fixed on the federal agents at the doors. He knew the law. He knew that what was on that screen was no longer a civil dispute. It was an execution order for a corporate empire. The Hawaii facility was the only asset left with the clean fabrication labs needed to manufacture the real arrays before the Pentagon's quality assurance teams did their surprise inspection next week. Alyssa explained, her heart rate remaining completely steady at 60 beats per minute. You thought you could steal my grandfather's trust, use it to mask your treason, and bail out your luxury island estates while leaving me to take the fall as the nominal asset holder. She reached down, picked up the case file that Cassandra had flicked her cigarette ash onto, and calmly blew the gray dust back into her face. The Pentagon didn't find out through an audit, Cassandra. Alyssa said, a cold, lethal smile appearing behind her eyes. They found out because I am the oversight director for the entire black budget supply line. I am the one who built the encryption matrix you tried to hack. She raised her black encrypted tablet one last time, her thumb hovering over the final execution command within the .docs document interface. By the power vested in me under the National Defense Authorization Act and the Supreme Encryption Protocols of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Alyssa announced, her voice echoing through the sky anvil dome like a final judgment. I hereby declare Vance Global Marine and all subsidiary entities to be a threat to national security. She pressed her thumb down. The screen behind her went completely black. Simultaneously, every single digital device in the room, Cassandra's smartphone, Eleanor's tablet, Richard's laptop, flickered violently and died, replaced by a single flashing white emblem of the Department of Defense. Every bank account bearing the Vance name is frozen. Alyssa said, her voice completely calm as she turned her back on them. Every corporate asset is seized under federal emergency powers. Your homes, your vehicles, your shares, and your luxury estates are now property of the United States government. You are officially bankrupt, unvouched, and stripped of your corporate privileges, pending a military tribunal for high treason. She walked toward the heavy bronze doors, her boots striking the floor with absolute rhythmic certainty. Behind her, the sounds of Eleanor's aristocratic screams and Cassandra's desperate blubbering tears filled the air. But the sound didn't even reach Alyssa's ears. She had already left them behind in the dust of the earth. She stepped out into the crisp, cold air of the Seattle skyline, ready to return to the only home that had ever truly claimed her, the boundless, clean expanse of the deep blue abyss where nobody could ever buy her, sell her, or bring her down again. The heavy latches of Richard Vance's custom-built alligator briefcase closed with a sound like a small bone snapping underfoot. He was a legal shark who had built an entire career on the blood-slicked margins of corporate maritime restructuring and white-collar defense, but he was fundamentally a creature of survival. He had spent 30 years mapping the vulnerabilities of federal courts, and he knew instantly when a defense line had been completely compromised. The moment Judge Harold Bennett executed that trembling, reverent military salute, and the moment the digital architecture of the .docs classification protocol decrypted on the screens, Richard Vance realized he wasn't looking at a stubborn runaway daughter anymore. He was standing directly in the crosshairs of a 4-star admiral, commanding the strategic subsurface reconnaissance and black budget logistics directives. He was looking at a high-value asset of the National Security Council's cybersecurity division. With slow, terrifyingly deliberate movements, Richard didn't utter a single defensive syllable to his family. He didn't look at Eleanor, who was frantically clawing at his left sleeve, her massive diamond ring scratching the fine fabric of his charcoal jacket. Richard, fix this file, an emergency injunction, counter-sue for administrative overreach. Eleanor's voice had lost every trace of its cold aristocratic composure. It was now a shrill, scraping rasp of pure panic. They cannot seize our liquid capital. Those are commercial accounts. Tell them who we are. Richard Vance smoothly but violently pulled his arm out of her manicured grasp. His face was a mask of gray professional detachment. He slid his white gold fountain pen back into his breast pocket, snapped the brass locks of his case, and took 3 long steps back from the plaintiff's table. My contractual retainer with Vance Global Marine. Richard stated, his voice flat, directing his words exclusively to Judge Bennett, and the grim-faced NCIS admiral, standing at the doors, was strictly limited to civil asset consultation regarding a private family trust. My firm has 0 knowledge, 0 participation, and absolute non-alignment with any international supply anomalies. microchip falsifications or violations of Title 18 of the United States Criminal Code. Richard, Arthur. Vance gasped, his chest heaving under his monogrammed shirt, his throat tight. You've taken $12 million from my executive board this quarter alone. You represent our dynasty. As of this second, Mr. Vance, I represent my own license to practice law, Richard said without an ounce of human shame. He turned toward Alyssa, his spine bending into a shallow, calculated bow of pure submission. Admiral Vance, if the Department of Justice requires my firm's cooperation or our internal forensic ledgers regarding Cassandra Vance's unauthorized logistics allocations in Ohio and international waters, my office will provide total unredacted disclosure within 24 hours. He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't look back at the broken family that had fed his bank accounts for a decade. Richard Vance walked toward the exit, his polished Oxfords moving with frantic speed, navigating past the armed tactical operators, who stepped aside on the briefest nod from the commanding officer. The heavy bronze-reinforced doors of the Sky Anvil Dome opened for him, just wide enough to let the lawyer slip through, leaving the Vance monarchy completely exposed, unrepresented, and utterly defenseless against the storm. The silence left in Richard's wake didn't last 5 seconds. Cassandra Vance, the DCIS agent, announced, his voice a hammer falling on cold iron. Step away from the table and place your hands behind your head. Cassandra didn't step away. She broke. Her legs, which had only ever known the plush carpets of private jets and premium leather boardroom chairs, completely collapsed beneath her weight. She slid out of her seat, her knees slamming into the champagne-soaked wood of the platform, her face twisted into an ugly, blubbering mask of sweat and smeared eyeliner. No, this is a mistake. It was an asset. Optimization. I didn't sell anything to foreigners, Cassandra shrieked, her hands flailing wildly as she tried to crawl beneath the heavy mahogany conference table, her pristine silk gown dragging through the puddle of spilled Roederer Cristal wine. Mother, don't let them take me. It was just numbers. I was just adjusting the margin targets. It's not treason, it's just business. A heavy steel-toed tactical boot stepped directly into her path, blocking her escape. 2 massive body-armored DCIS. Federal agents leaned down, grabbed Cassandra by the collar of her bespoke dress, and hauled her to her feet like a sack of garbage. Clack! Click! The heavy, matte black steel of a pair of peerless handcuffs snapped tightly around her soft, manicured wrists, locking behind her back with an unyielding, metallic finality. Cassandra! Arthur Vance roared, the primal instinct of a father finally overriding his corporate calculation. He lunged across the floor, his hands reaching out to rip his eldest daughter away from the federal agents. Get your hands off her! You don't have a warrant for this. This is a corporate restructure. Before Arthur could even bridge the gap, the third tactical operator moved with the fluid, violent economy of a trained operator. A heavy Kevlar-gloved forearm slammed into Arthur's chest, driving the air out of his lungs in a sharp, guttural wheeze, while a sweep of the agent's boot took Arthur's legs out from under him. The patriarch of the Vance family went down hard, his face slamming into the edge of his own leather chair before hitting the floor, his cheek pressed flat against the dirty carpet just inches away from the salt-crusted combat boot of the daughter he had spent a lifetime disowning. Eleanor stood frozen at the head of the table, her face completely drained of color, looking exactly like a piece of cheap newsprint that had been left out in the rain. Her eyes darted from her weeping daughter, whose nose was now bleeding onto her silk collar, to her husband, groaning on the floor, and finally to Alyssa. The realization was a physical blow that aged her 10 years in 10 seconds. The child she had treated as an unvouched overhead cost. The girl whose military acceptance letter she had fed into a Newport mansion shredder while laughing at her dreams. The person they had sneered at as a park clerk warehouse sweeping non-entity was the absolute architect of their execution. Alyssa wasn't just surviving their malice, she was ruling the very depths they relied on to transport their wealth. She was the hand that had flipped the switch to darkness on their entire world. The high-rise HVAC hummed the sound now mimicking the steady cold breeze of the high-altitude flatlands. Eleanore Vance's knees finally gave out. She didn't drop with the chaotic panic of her daughter. She sank slowly, deliberately, until her knees hit the luxury carpet right at the welt of Alyssa's grease-stained left boot. Her manicured fingers, tipped with blood-red polish, reached out and clutched at the rough, salt-crusted canvas of Alyssa's operational trousers. "Alyssa, please!" Eleanor sobbed, real, unscripted tears, finally washing away the expensive foundation on her cheeks, leaving deep, ragged tracks through her makeup. "She's your sister. She's young. She didn't know what she was doing. You have the intelligence clearance. You have the .docs overrides. You can make a call. Just one call to the Pentagon. Tell them it was an internal quality audit. Tell them we are restructuring the maritime contracts. Save your sister, Alyssa. Save your father's name." Alyssa looked down at her. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable slab of military granite. Her heart rate sat locked at 60 beats per minute. She didn't pull her boot away from Eleanor's grasp, nor did she lean down to offer comfort. She looked at her stepmother with the same clinical, detached evaluation a commander gives to a piece of dead debris floating across an active navigation channel. Slowly, Alyssa raised her left hand, reached up to the brim of her service dress cap, and adjusted the gold-embroidered anchor and eagle of the United States Navy until they sat perfectly aligned with her brow. "I told you once before, Eleanor," Alyssa said, her voice dropping into a register that was colder than the waters of Puget Sound in January. "I do not negotiate with traitors, and I do not carry parasites who happen to wear bespoke clothes." "We gave you life," Arthur groaned from the floor, his voice choked with blood and dust. "We built the foundation you walked on." "You built nothing but an invoice," Alyssa replied, looking down at the ledger of childhood expenses that still sat smudged with Cassandra's cigarette ash on the podium. "You treated my life like a capital investment that failed to return a dividend. You wanted to liquidate me into an alliance to secure your credit lines. Well, the market has cleared, Arthur. The valuation of your arrogance has just hit zero." She turned her eyes back to Eleanor, whose fingers were trembling against her boot. "The invoice for your 15 years of cruelty, your systemic humiliation, and your betrayal of this nation's defense line has just come due." Alyssa whispered her words, cutting through the weeping woman like a winter draft. "Pay it in full. Live with it." She didn't look back. Alyssa turned on her heel, her heavy boots pivoting smoothly on the white carpet, leaving a deep black smudge of jet fuel and brine residue right where Eleanor's knees were planted. From the shadows near the bronze double doors, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy, weather-worn utility jacket stepped forward. It was Daniel, her husband, a veteran city firefighter who had spent his life running into the fires other people ran away from. He had spent the last 3 hours waiting in the high-security staging area, his quiet, unyielding presence the only real sanctuary she had ever known. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply reached out his thick, calloused hand, closing over Alyssa's gloved fingers, wrapping her in an absolute silent protection that no amount of Vance money could ever buy. Together they walked out of the Sky Anvil Dome, leaving the screams of the paper monarchy to be buried beneath the heavy iron curtain of federal justice. 3 years later. July 2029. The light inside the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C. was magnificent. It streamed down through the massive historic windows illuminating the polished brass, the massive gray steel hulls, and the legendary battleships that had defined humanity's refusal to be conquered by the storms of the world. Alyssa walked slowly down the polished floor of the main pavilion. She wasn't wearing her uniform today. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue linen coat, dark tailored trousers, and leather boots that were spotlessly clean. The 4-star Admiral pins and the ribbon rose of the Navy Cross were locked away in a safe at her quarters. She didn't need the medal on her chest to know who she was anymore. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the tiny, warm palm of a 4-year-old girl named Clara. Clara had the dark, striking eyes of the Vance family, but her face was completely free of the bitter, calculating malice that had ruined her mother. When Cassandra had been sentenced to 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for first-degree defense fraud and economic espionage, her socialite partners had fled the country, abandoning the infant child like an inconvenient piece of unhedged baggage. The Vance assets had been entirely liquidated. The mansion sold at federal auction, and Eleanor and Arthur were currently living in a tiny rented apartment in the outskirts of Philadelphia, surviving on a state-capped pension, while their names were permanently scrubbed from every maritime executive board in America. When the social services report had landed on Alyssa's desk 3 years ago, asking what should be done with Cassandra's abandoned daughter, Alyssa hadn't hesitated. She had signed the adoption papers with the same definitive stroke of the pen she used to launch submarine strike groups. She would not let another child grow up as a worthless overhead cost in the shadow of that family's ruin. "Auntie Alyssa, look." Clara squealed, her tiny finger pointing upward toward the massive hull of a legendary battleship display. The historic vessel stood magnificent under the afternoon sun, peaceful, silent, and permanently free from the violence of the deep trenches. Alyssa stopped leaning down to hoist the little girl up into her arms, resting Clara against her shoulder. The child smelled of clean summer air, entirely free of the scent of cigarette smoke, stale champagne, or hydraulic fluid. "Is that where you used to live, Auntie?" Clara asked, her small fingers tracing the golden anchor emblem embroidered onto the casual cap Alyssa wore to keep the sun out of her eyes. Alyssa looked up at the great open expanse of the museum roof and then past it into the deep, brilliant blue of the sky outside. For the first time in her life, her heart rate wasn't locked at 60 beats per minute out of tactical necessity. It beat with a soft, natural, and deeply human rhythm. "No, sweetie," Alyssa said, a soft, genuine smile finally breaking across her face as she pressed her cheek against the little girl's soft hair. "I don't live down there anymore. I just went down into the dark to make sure the ocean would be clean for you." She set Clara down on the floor, and together, hand in hand, the survivor and the heir to a clean legacy walked out into the warm afternoon sun, victorious, proud, and absolutely beautifully free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.